Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text. So I want you to picture the period at the end of a printed sentence. Just, that tiny little speck.
Right, it's microscopic.
Yeah, and that is the exact size of the single cell that you started as, which is wild to think about.
It really is.
But within just the first 8 weeks of growth, that microscopic dot increases its weight. I think it's 25-fold?
Yeah, 25 times its original weight.
Right. And it establishes the rudiments of literally every single major organ system. I mean, the sheer velocity of that biological organization is just staggering.
It's an absolute masterclass in structural engineering, honestly. And, welcome to a special deep dive brought to you by the Last Minute Lecture team.
We are so glad you're here.
Yeah, if you're tuning in, you are very likely a college student prepping for your first major anatomy and physiology exam, specifically on development and inheritance.
The big one.
Exactly. So today, we are basically acting as your one-on-one tutoring guides. We're going to break down Chapter 27 for you.
We're going to trace that whole incredible 9-month journey from that single microscopic cell we just talked about all the way to a fully formed human.
Right. And we'll also decode the genetic blueprints that orchestrate the whole thing in the exact order your textbook lays it out.
So to really understand how anatomical structure dictates physiological function, we have to start at the literal beginning, which is conception.
Right. Gestation.
Yeah.
Which is, the time the developing embryo and fetus actually spends inside the uterus.
And that's divided into 3 trimesters, right?
Yep, 3 trimesters. And broadly speaking, we categorize this timeline as prenatal development, which is the embryonic and fetal stages, and then postnatal development,
which is everything from birth all the way to maturity.
Exactly. But the initiating event for all of this, the true starting line, is fertilization.
Okay, so let's talk about the visual the textbook gives us here, because the scale difference between the 2 gametes is just crazy.
It's huge. The secondary oocyte, the egg, is massive. It's roughly 2,000 times larger than a single sperm.
Wow, 2,000 times.
Yeah. So during fertilization, you have this giant cell, and it is just completely swarmed by these tiny thread-like sperm trying to break through its outer defenses.
It's basically a profound numbers game, right? Because out of nearly 200 million sperm introduced in a typical ejaculation, only about, 10,000 even enter a uterine tube?
Right, and then fewer than 100 actually reach the isthmus where the oocyte is waiting.
And the craziest part to me is that even though only one single sperm ultimately fertilizes the egg, dozens are physically required to be there at the surface.
Yeah, they have to be there. And the reason for that comes down to the oocyte's primary defensive wall.
The corona radiata.
Exactly. It's this thick layer of cells. And a single sperm just does not carry enough of the acrosomal enzymes in its head to dissolve the intercellular cement holding that wall together.
It kind of reminds me of, a team of sappers trying to breach a fortress wall.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, because one soldier can't just knock down a stone wall alone. You need this collective, coordinated effort of dozens of sappers all chipping away at the defenses, concentrating their explosives in one spot to create a breach.
Right, and once that breach is open,
only one soldier actually gets through to the inner sanctum.
That is exactly what happens. And once that victorious sperm makes contact and its membrane fuses with the oocyte, it triggers this physiological domino effect.
This is oocyte activation, right?
Yes. The physical fusion causes a massive release of calcium ions from the smooth endoplasmic reticulum inside the oocyte.
And that calcium wave is super important. It acts as an intracellular messenger.
A critical one. First, that calcium wave causes the release of enzymes that instantly harden the layer just inside the corona radiata.
That's the zona pellucida.
Right, the zona pellucida hardens. And this is vital because it stops any other sperm from getting in.
Because if multiple sperm enter, that would be polyspermy, right?
Yeah, and that genetic overload would be fatal to the cell. So the hardening prevents that. Then second, the calcium spike triggers the oocyte to finally complete meiosis II.
Making it officially an ovum.
Exactly. And third, it rapidly revs up the ovum's metabolic rate. It's preparing for the massive energy demands of cellular division.
Right, because right after that metabolic surge, we get amphimixis.
Yep. The male and female pronuclei fuse together. They combine their genetic payloads.
So now we finally have a zygote with a full 46 chromosomes.
You got it. And almost immediately, cleavage begins. The zygote starts rapidly dividing into smaller and smaller cells called blastomeres.
But it's not actually getting bigger overall, right?
No, it's just multiplying the number of cells within the same physical space of the pre-embryo.
Okay, so we have this hollow ball of generic, rapidly dividing cells. The next massive hurdle is how those totally unspecialized cells organize into, a highly structured human form.
Right, and that organization happens through a process called gastrulation.
Gastrulation.
Yeah. The cells begin to migrate and they fold inward, differentiating into 3 highly specialized primary germ layers. And for your exam, you really need to mentally map these layers to their final anatomical destinations.
Okay, let's break them down. So the ectoderm, which is the layer on the outside.
Right, ecto meaning outer. That gives rise to the nervous system, so the brain and spinal cord, and also the epidermis of the skin.
Got it. Then we have the mesoderm, the middle layer of migrating cells.
Yes. The mesoderm forms the bulk of the body's structural and transport systems.
So that would be like the dermis of the skin, the skeletal system, muscles.
Exactly. Skeletal, muscular, and the cardiovascular system all come from the mesoderm.
Okay, and finally the endoderm, the innermost layer.
That forms the mucous epithelial linings of the respiratory and digestive systems.
Okay, so while the embryo is establishing these 3 germ layers, it also has to build a lifeline to the mother, right?
Yes, the extraembryonic membranes begin to form. And specifically, you'll see diagrams of a membrane called the chorion.
And the chorion creates these finger-like projections, the chorionic vil.
Right. These villi physically invade the mother's endometrium, and they actually break down maternal blood vessels to form this complex interface.
Which is the placenta.
Exactly. And the embryo eventually bulges out into a fluid-filled amniotic cavity, suspended and tethered to that placenta by the umbilical cord.
So the placenta is basically handling everything: nutrient, gas, and waste exchange.
Yep. Maternal blood literally bathes those chorionic villi. Through diffusion, oxygen and nutrients cross over into the fetal blood supply, while carbon dioxide and waste cross back to the mother.
That's amazing. And with that lifeline set up, organogenesis, the actual formation of the organs, can start.
Yes, and this is a key concept. Because these foundational rudiments are just appearing, the first trimester is considered the most dangerous prenatal stage.
Now wait, I want to push back on that for a second.
Sure.
Because the 3rd trimester is when the fetus gains the most absolute weight, and it's when the organ systems actually begin to really function.
Right.
So it seems kind of counterintuitive that the first trimester, when everything is just microscopic, is the most perilous.
I get why that seems backward, but think about the mechanics of building a house or any highly complex system.
Okay.
In the first trimester, you are laying down the core structural foundation. You're forming the neural tube that will become the central nervous system. You're building the initial pumping tubes that have to perfectly fold into a heart.
Right.
If a group of cells migrates to the wrong location, or a chemical signal misfires during embryogenesis, that error is permanently baked into the fundamental architecture.
Oh, I see. A cracked foundation ruins the whole house.
Exactly. By the 3rd trimester, development is mostly about cellular hypertrophy. The organs are just growing in size and refining what they already have.
So an error late in gestation might just mean lower birth weight. But a structural error in week 4 compromises the entire organism.
Exactly. It leaves no room for error. And building that foundation requires an immense amount of raw materials.
And since the fetus doesn't have its own functional organs to process nutrients or clear waste early on, 100% of that debt falls on the mother.
Which leads to an extreme physiological toll. If you look at the textbook's cross-sectional views comparing a non-pregnant and pregnant abdomen at full term,
it's intense. The expanding uterus pushes the maternal organs completely out of their normal positions.
Right. The stomach, the liver, the intestines, they are all shoved upward and severely compressed against the diaphragm.
It really is like overpacking a suitcase. But, with a critical twist.
How so?
Like you aren't just physically sitting on the suitcase to zip it shut. You are overpacking a suitcase that also contains the engine running the whole system. And now you're forcing that engine to work twice as hard with half the ventilation space.
That is a very accurate, if uncomfortable way to put it. The mother is breathing, eating, and filtering waste for 2, all while her internal real estate is just vanishing.
Yeah. Her cardiovascular system has to increase its blood volume by almost 50%.
Just to handle the demands of the placenta. And her respiratory rate goes up because that compressed diaphragm makes deep breathing physically difficult.
So eventually, the uterus and the fetus hit a physical limit. The placenta just can't keep up with the metabolic demands of the fetus anymore.
And that discrepancy causes fetal stress, which alters hormone levels for both the mother and the fetus.
All right, there's a drop in progesterone and a sharp rise in oxytocin and prostaglandins.
And those hormonal shifts initiate a positive feedback loop of uterine contractions, which brings us to labor and delivery.
Which has 3 distinct stages. First is the dilation stage.
The cervix begins to actively dilate and contractions become regular and forceful. And late in this stage, the amnion ruptures.
That's the water breaking, right?
Exactly. Then the second stage is the expulsion stage. The cervix is completely dilated to about 10 centimeters, and continuous contractions push the fetus down the cervical canal until delivery.
And the final phase is the placental stage.
Right. After the newborn is out, the empty uterus keeps contracting. This tears the connections between the endometrium and the placenta and ejects it, the afterbirth.
And that birth abruptly severs that placental lifeline.
Yeah.
So now the newborn system suddenly have to work independently.
Right. The lungs have to inflate with air. The cardiovascular system has to instantly reroute blood flow away from the umbilical vessels and into the pulmonary circuit.
It's a massive physiological shift.
Mm-hmm.
And postnatal development tracks this ongoing maturation across 5 life stages.
Yes. The neonatal period, which is the first 28 days, then infancy, childhood, adolescence, and eventually maturity.
Which slowly leads to senescence or aging. But going back to that newborn, even though it's breathing its own air and pumping its own blood, it still relies entirely on maternal nourishment.
Yes, through lactation. And the textbook gives a great flowchart on the milk ejection reflex. It's a brilliant piece of biological engineering.
Let's walk through it. So when an infant sucks, tactile receptors in the areola are stimulated.
Right. Neural impulses travel from those receptors up the spinal cord and directly to the maternal brain.
Specifically to the hypothalamus.
Exactly. And in response, the hypothalamus triggers the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland to release oxytocin into the bloodstream.
And when that circulating oxytocin reaches the mammary glands, it targets these specialized myoepithelial cells in the walls of the milk ducts.
It causes those cells to physically contract, which forcefully ejects the milk.
You know, we always hear pop psychology talk about oxytocin as this vague love or cuddle hormone.
Right, the bonding hormone.
Yeah, but looking at this flowchart, it's acting as a highly specific mechanical messenger in a biological feedback loop. It's literally just physically squeezing the ducts.
It is very mechanical, yeah. Hormones are highly targeted. And speaking of hormonal cascades, as the child grows and approaches adolescence, we hit puberty.
Which also begins in the hypothalamus.
Right. The hypothalamus dramatically ramps up its production of GnRH, gonadotropin-releasing hormone.
And that GnRH acts on the anterior pituitary gland, stimulating it to release FSH and LH, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone.
Yes. And those two hormones target the gonads. So the testicular or ovarian cells respond by producing mature gametes and secreting massive amounts of sex hormones.
Testosterone in males and estrogens in females.
Exactly. And these hormones drive the development of secondary sex characteristics: hair distribution, fat deposition, vocal cord thickness.
They also trigger that sudden acceleration in bone growth, right?
The growth spurt, yes. And that continues until those same-sex hormones eventually cause the epiphyseal cartilages, the growth plates in the long bones, to completely ossify and close.
Okay, so we've traced the physical development from a single cell all the way to a mature adult. Now, let's pull back the curtain and look at the source code that dictated all of this.
Genetics and inheritance.
Yes, because every nucleated somatic cell in the human body carries copies of those original 46 chromosomes established way back at amphimixis.
Right. And those chromosomes and the thousands of genes arrayed along them make up an individual's genotype.
The genotype is basically the architectural blueprint. It contains all the instructions.
And the phenotype is the finished, observable house, your actual anatomical and physiological traits.
Right. And because we inherit one chromosome from our mother and one from our father to make a homologous pair, we have 2 copies of every gene, which are called alleles.
Yes. If both parents pass down the exact same allele for a specific trait, you are homozygous for that trait. If they pass down different alleles, you're heterozygous.
And how those heterozygous alleles interact determines the inheritance pattern.
Exactly. In simple inheritance, a single pair of alleles strictly dictates the phenotype, like strict dominance, where a dominant allele completely masks a recessive one.
But simple inheritance also includes codominance, right?
It does. Blood type AB is the classic example here. Inheriting a type A allele from one parent and a type B allele from the other means neither dominates. The red blood cells just express both traits simultaneously.
Okay, but most of our traits aren't that simple. They use polygenic inheritance.
Right, which is far more complex. Multiple different genes on different chromosomes all interact to determine a single phenotype. Hair color, skin color, those operate on a sliding scale based on how these genes interact.
But for simple inheritance, we can use a Punnett square to track probabilities, especially for sex-linked inheritance.
Yes, where genes are carried specifically on the sex chromosomes. The textbook uses red-green colorblindness as a great example of an X-linked trait.
Let's walk through that visual. So, assume a mother is a carrier. She has one normal X chromosome and one X chromosome bearing the recessive colorblindness allele.
Right. Her phenotype is normal vision because her healthy dominant gene masks the defective recessive one.
Okay, and the father has normal vision too, so he has a normal X and a normal Y.
So any daughter they have will receive that normal X chromosome from the father. That guarantees she has normal vision.
But she still has a 50% chance of getting the recessive allele from her mom, making her a carrier.
Exactly. But for a son, the math changes completely.
Right, because a son must inherit his Y chromosome from his father. So a single X chromosome has to come from his mother.
Yep. He has a 50% chance of getting the normal X and a 50% chance of getting the colorblind X.
And this really points out the genetic unfairness of X-linked traits for males.
It really does.
Because a man only has one X chromosome, whatever allele is on there, good or bad, is what he gets. He doesn't have a second X chromosome to mask a recessive disorder like a woman might.
Right. And this mechanism leads naturally into our clinical module. What happens when the blueprint itself has structural errors?
We look at karyotypes for this, right?
Yes. A karyotype is a complete visual map of an individual's chromosomes lined up in pairs. You can literally count them and see gross abnormalities.
And the most common viable one is trisomy 21, or Down syndrome.
Right. It happens during meiosis through a process called non-disjunction, where a homologous pair fails to separate.
So if an egg with 2 copies of chromosome 21 is fertilized by a normal sperm, the zygote gets 3 copies instead of 2.
Exactly, and that extra genetic material alters the blueprint, causing intellectual disability and often cardiovascular issues. And as the text notes, there is a direct correlation between trisomy 21 and increasing maternal age.
Because the older the oocyte, the higher the physical risk of non-disjunction when it finally divides.
Yes. We also see abnormalities with the sex chromosomes, like Klinefelter syndrome, which is an XY pattern.
So the Y makes them phenotypically male, but the extra X disrupts normal endocrine function.
Right. They have decreased androgens and are generally sterile.
And then there's Turner syndrome, which is an exomonosomy.
Only a single female sex chromosome is present. They are phenotypically female, but without the second X, the ovaries remain non-functional.
You know, it's interesting. Why do we only really see a handful of these, like trisomy 21 or Turner syndrome, clinically?
Well, it connects right back to the beginning of our discussion. Embryogenesis is so delicate. Missing a whole chromosome or having an extra one usually causes the whole developmental machine to break down.
Oh, I see. It's lethal before delivery.
Exactly. Most chromosomal abnormalities result in an early end to the pregnancy. The ones we see clinically are the exceptionally rare exceptions that the body can actually physically tolerate.
Our biology is incredibly resilient, but that underlying code is just vast. I mean, the human genome has over 20,000 protein-coding genes.
And about 1.4 million single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs.
Just tiny single-base variations that make our traits unique. But the most fascinating frontier right now has to be epigenetics.
Oh, absolutely. This is where inherited traits are altered without changing the DNA sequence at all.
Right, like environmental factors or stress can physically tag the DNA with methyl groups. It basically turns specific genes on or off without altering the actual underlying code.
Understanding all of this, the anatomy and physiology of development, really gives you profound insight into how fragile yet incredibly resilient human biology is.
It really does. And I want to leave you with a final thought on that epigenetic frontier as you study.
It's a great thought experiment.
If our environment and our physical stresses can chemically turn our genes on or off without changing the DNA itself, our body's basically writing a biological diary of our lives. And is that chemical diary something we are literally passing down to the next generation.
It is a powerful mechanism to ponder while you review these concepts.
Absolutely. Well, from all of us at the Last Minute Lecture team, thank you for studying with us.
Yeah.
And good luck on your anatomy exam. You've got this.